The Illinois primary is over and the results are in. But what does it mean for the state? We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois government and politics. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, with Illinois Issues and NPR Illinois. And with me today is Kent Redfield, Professor Emeritus of Political Science with UIS. Professor Redfield, welcome back.
Good to be here.
And Bruce Rushton, staff writer with the Illinois Times. Bruce, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
So, as you probably are aware from all of the various campaign ads that you have just been barraged with over the last few weeks, Illinois' primary was this last Tuesday. We're going to break down some of the results for you today and tell you what they mean for politics as they are kind of ongoing and the impasse and the fight between the speaker and the governor, and give you a little context on these races. So, Professor Redfield, let's jump right in. The race that folks are probably watching the most as far as what it meant for the fight between the governor and the speaker was Ken Duncan versus Juliana Stratton, a race in Chicago, House race. Tell us a little bit about the race and how that panned out.
Well, I mean, clearly this was an election that was basically a proxy war between organized labor and certainly the indirectly the speaker and then the governor and his allies backing the incumbent Democrat Ken Duncan. And so potentially this could have been a $6 million primary election. We've never spent, we spent $1 million is about as much as we've ever spent on a primary election, a legislative race. And so about $4 million on the Duncan side, about $2 million on the Stratton side. And it was a brutal campaign, and Stratton actually won with a very comfortable margin. And so it was a pretty, obviously for Duncan a huge defeat, but also for the allies of the governor. This was an independent expenditure committee that the governor's people supporting the governor had put together allegedly to, a Democratic leaning group to back Democrats that back the governor, Illinois Go. And they put in a huge amount of money. At one point, right before the election, this group gave money to the State Chamber of Commerce that formed another expenditure committee, independent expenditure committee, and spent $900,000+ on an ad, supporting Ken Duncan, who doesn't have a particularly good business record, and so it was that kind of campaign. I mean, they really pulled out all the stops, and Duncan was went down big.
And Duncan definitely outspending his opponent, but his opponent did have a bit of maybe an ace up her sleeve, or maybe she might not have known it was there, but President Obama cut a commercial endorsing her for the race. Have we ever seen anything like this, Bruce, in a state legislative race where the sitting president steps in and
I don't know.
takes a stand?
No, that seems somewhat unprecedented. As the president had said in his address to the General Assembly, Mr. Duncan, we'll talk later. Well, he talked, and it certainly made a difference. I think that the takeaway from this, at least, is it's got to make the governor, if he's wise, sit back and say, money isn't everything. It didn't matter how much money he threw in this race, he was going to lose. And Duncan was a deeply flawed candidate for a number of reasons. And so what it says is that if you take a lot of money and back a deeply flawed candidate, you're not necessarily going to get anywhere. And so I think the local race closer to home here in Springfield, McCann versus Benton. McCann was a deeply flawed candidate in many ways, and yet won comfortably. And Bryce Benton, frankly, was did not comport himself well, I think, generally on the campaign trail. He was clearly in the governor's shadows. Near the end, he made some sort of a campaign appearance at a local restaurant and didn't say anything to the voters. He was there alongside Governor Rauner and let Rauner do all the talking, which spoke volumes, I think. And so they just got to get better candidates. I mean, because these two were not the best and the brightest, frankly, that he could have come up with, and it just didn't go anywhere. So you got to have substance behind the bucks, and they just didn't have that.
and maybe 300 million spent against McCann. And we have to be clear. I mean, McCann had voted for an arbitration bill that the governor did not want, that was favored by the by ASME, and Duncan had not supported a bill that the Democrats wanted to put money back into child care. And so this was all about the turnaround agenda and the budget battle, and that's why it's just two races, and the numbers don't change. You still have the same number of Democrats and Republicans, but you've got a that was the significance in it. And what it's going to mean going forward, it would have been a big deal if Duncan had survived and McCann had gotten beat. I don't know what the governor's going to draw from this in terms of the lesson. And my suspicion is that we're going to have this same sort of thing play out in the general election, that it's really not going to make a big change in how things are going to go forward over the next 6-9 months.
Oh, I think one possibility is this demonstrated perhaps to middle-of-the-road moderate Republicans in the legislature that they don't have to walk lockstep with Rauner. That his threats to get him come election time aren't necessarily going to hold stiff. They're not necessarily going to spell the end of their careers. And so I think perhaps that if I was a governor, I'd be a little worried here going forward about being able to keep my party in line in the legislature when it's been demonstrated that it isn't just because you go against the governor doesn't mean you're going to lose.
Even though McCann, was victorious in that race, it was a pretty brutal race. Do you think the amount of money and the brutalness of the ads would be a deterrent, even though he did, he came out maybe not unscathed, but he did come out the other side?
Well, I wouldn't want to be out there on an island. I would not want to just go out and take a vote. I'd like to have some people with me. If it's gonna be a revolt, Democrat or Republican, against the leadership, I don't want to do this as one individual, because obviously when you get isolated, then these sorts of things can happen. And they were brutal. It was a brutal campaign in Chicago. It was a brutal campaign here, and nobody wants to go through that. But there is uncertainty about what the governor's money means and how bad he can hurt people. That's less clear after this. But I'm not sure that's going to deter the governor from running the same playbook in the general election and having dozens of a dozen House races and 6-8 Senate races that look like what we just went through.
But I mean, you also got to look at stuff like, for example, the MAP grant issue. That's important, I think, also to Republicans as well as to Democrats. And so if I'm in a swing district, if I've got to face the voters and I've got a chance that this is going to be made into a campaign issue against me, that I've cut funding for education, then, I don't know that Rauner has a huge amount of support in his caucus for that. They're going along, at least for the time being, but I think that could raise questions about how long they'll go along with some of these issues.
Professor, you've been watching primary races in the states for a while now. Any surprises this time?
Oh, there's always a few surprises where an incumbent that you didn't think was in trouble gets beat, but the map is such that there just is not that much competition. You've got a lot of incumbents that basically won when they filed their nominating petitions because they don't have a challenger in the primary or the general election, and so those were the I was surprised that we're not sure whose money it was, but again, you assume the governor had a hand in it. They spent $1 million against the speaker in his own district. He won very easily, but that's kind of tweaking the bear a little bit, and again, that's kind of indicative of kind of the governor and the people around him, how they are kind of approaching this. And so again, I'm not sure you're going to get a huge change, but I agree with Bruce. I mean, when pushes come to shove, we have backed off on things like child care and some other things, and certainly I'm hopeful that we're going to put some kind of Band-Aid on higher education so that we don't, if you fix it in August, it's too late because you will have already lost 25%, 30% of the normal enrollment you would have had at these universities, because people are applying now. They're not suddenly going to apply in August. So I'm hoping we're going to get something done that will at least take care of that. And I think people will feel that pressure, particularly members that have public universities in their district.
I mean, I'm not getting any sense, and maybe you folks are feeling differently, I'm not getting any sense that budget's imminent here by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, folks are just hoping for maybe a few fixes around the edges. But I think everybody's kind of just given up hope that these guys are going to pass a budget anytime soon, and probably not until at least after the general election.
I think the idea, and Professor Redfield, I think we've talked about this a little bit before, the idea of making the tax increase a campaign issue in November pretty much takes it off the table until that point, right?
Yeah, I think that's clear. I mean, you're not going to have revenue before you have the general election. You can't fix the situation we're in without revenue, without serious recalibration and cuts in terms of what's the core, but then you can't pay for it, and you can't get out of debt unless you address revenue and the whole of the revenue picture.
And that's in part because of the tax increase sunsetting, but also in part because the money is currently being spent far beyond the revenue coming in, right?
Yeah, and what people want, the people that are rating the Illinois bonds, the credit agencies, they want stability, and you can't get stability without having a revenue system that's broader than just the income tax. I mean, you've got to broaden the base, and you've got to have a core set of priorities and figure out a way to pay for them and pay off your bills. And we're a long way from that. So
and way over on the side, to some extent, is the comptroller who's waving her hand saying, wait a minute, it's going to be a $10 billion problem. She just came out with that in terms of unpaid bills, and it's not getting any better. And so she's forecasting, I think, $10 billion by
June.
By June.
Yeah.
And again, nobody's thinking it's good, at least, if they pass a budget and tax increase before election time, good luck with that.
Well, another race that was a Cook County race, but that folks were watching throughout the state that, could be viewed as kind of an upset would be Anita Alvarez. She was defeated by Kim Fox in her primary race for state's attorney. And Bruce, folks are kind of chalking this up to some degree to fallout from the Laquan McDonald case, which we've talked about on the show before. Any thoughts on this race and how it turned out?
I don't think it's a big surprise, frankly. I mean, Alvarez has had so much bad publicity, and deservedly so, about the Laquan McDonald shooting, and in the broader scheme, her approach to holding police officers accountable in terms of charging them with crimes when somebody gets seriously hurt or killed. She doesn't have a strong record on that, and that is probably one of the top, if not the top issue in Chicago. She was on her heels. She was defensive. And she was not in a position where she could be campaigning from the strength of an incumbency. And so I don't think that was a particular surprise at all. I mean, this is chickens roosting, the fallout of Laquan McDonald, and there'll probably be continued fallout.
And just, I mean, for comparison's sake, this is a countywide race. There are millions of people and millions of registered voters in Cook County. Probably about 3 candidates, probably a $5 million race. And so, we may end up spending more on a House district with 120,000 people than on a hotly contested countywide race in Cook County. That just shows you how crazy the legislative spending has gotten in terms of how much that's changed over just a few short election cycles.
And that would be in the Duncan race.
Yeah, the Duncan Stratton race we may have spent more there than we spent on a hotly contested countywide race in Cook County. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, it is, and when you look at it in terms of scale, a state's attorney, especially in Cook County or any county really, that's a really, really important job. That has more oomph to it, so to speak, than any individual legislator outside of perhaps the Speaker or the Senate President. And so to see this kind of money spent on just a legislative or a regular legislative race, and to have that, a state's attorney's race when that position is so critically important, just out of whack.
So another thing that was maybe a little atypical about this primary is that we saw some pretty high voter turnout in some areas, and some counties were even ran out of ballots here in Springfield. I believe the poll stayed up until, was it 8:30, Bruce?
I believe it was 8:30.
Because it typically closed at 7 because some precincts ran out of ballots. Professor Redfield, what was driving that? I mean, there's a lot of Republican turnout. Was it the presidential race for the most part that was driving that turnout?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly if you've got a local race, the McCann race here, the state's attorney's race in Cook County, then people are aware of that there's an election going on. But presidential always draws more turnout, and to have a hotly contested race on both sides, and for Illinois to be making a difference in terms of the outcome, and so who won Illinois had a big impact on the momentum within the Democratic side, and it had a big impact in terms of putting Trump in it wasn't a slam dunk for him, but a much more favorable position. So the fact that it's just been so high profile in the national media, and then and Illinois makes a difference this time around. So we got a lot of attention. And we had Hillary Clinton and Ted Cruz were in Springfield on Tuesday, which is, you hardly ever see presidential candidates in downstate Illinois, or in Illinois in general. By the time you get to Illinois primary, it's usually pretty much over.
And of course, Trump and Clinton winning here, but Clinton didn't walk away with it maybe as much as folks thought she could have a few months ago. Bruce, any takeaway on the presidential races?
Well, the Democratic side, that's over. I mean, it's I think that Sanders has put up a real good fight. He's had an effect. I think the question globally now is will he go third party in the fall? But the Democratic race is all but over. The Republican thing, I think, is fascinating. I'm not sure that I'm surprised by what happened here in Illinois. I think that I was a little surprised by how well Kasich did in Ohio. We knew he was going to do well. I don't know that we knew he was going to do as well as he did. And so I think the big story now, was a lot of other folks are saying, is this sure looks like it might be an open convention on the Republican side, and in which case, does Ryan become the candidate? This is going to sound nuts, but I'm thinking maybe they'll resurrect John McCain. But it's certainly not going to be either Cruz or Trump. And I frankly, I wonder whether Trump even really wanted to be president. The stuff that he said should have been political suicide, and he just keeps saying it. And part of me is thinking there's an inner Trump saying, I can't believe where I'm at. I say things that should be getting me be driving voters away in droves, and they just keep coming. So it'll be interesting, but I think the Democratic stuff is all but done.
Yeah, and there's still some of the national issues get reflected in Illinois. Sanders did well again among millennials, and it isn't just the idealism of youth, it's about people coming of age in the Great Recession and looking at an economic future that is pretty uncertain compared to other age cohorts in terms of that. And then you've got Sanders and Clinton and Trump both appeal to people that were hurt in the recession who have not come back in terms of, and so there are groups out there that are at play that both parties have to figure out how to effectively speak to, and so what this looks like in the fall, there's a lot more uncertainty. You can't just do red state, blue state, and replay the last two presidential elections. It's going to be a much more complex picture, and I think where the vote came from and how it played out in Illinois reflects that.
It's been interesting this year, and will continue to be, that in state government and federal level, it looks like the playbook is a little bit out the window. Things are a lot, unexpected things are happening left and right. So, while we're talking about the primary and talking about big spending and campaigns, Bruce, I wanted to touch on a story that you had for Illinois Times this week, looking into the disclosure reports that candidates do, saying what they spend all that money on, and you found some really interesting things.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me a little bit about the story, and then we'll talk a little bit about why this happens and how it works.
Sure. I mean, I got interested in this kind of as an offshoot of what was going on with Frank Matino, whose campaign spending is now under scrutiny. He's the Auditor General. There's some questionable spending that took place while he was a state legislator. And then also Senator McCann. He's got some questionable spending that became a campaign issue. And I thought to myself, you know, these guys wrote this down. They put it on paper knowing it was going to be posted on the internet. I wonder what else is out there. And so I looked at all 177 members of the General Assembly and focused on how they were spending the money, not how the money was coming in. And some of the stuff, frankly, surprised me. Maybe it shouldn't have. Multiple trips by the same legislator to China, trips to Puerto Rico, checks written to quote unknown. I mean, who'd you give the money to? I don't know. Monies paid for rent to an address here in Springfield that didn't exist. I mean, I spent 2 hours looking for this address, and I also checked with the post office until finally concluding the address doesn't exist. Legislator who reported that she had negative $24,000 plus in her campaign fund and no debt. I mean, it's mathematically impossible. Legislator that went to Las Vegas and stayed at the Hard Rock Hotel while the adult entertainment convention of the year was there. He denies being there. He said, as soon as I found out the porn stars were coming, I fled. And so, well, we got to take him at his word. But the takeaway from this is that some legislators I think are using their campaign funds in what most of us would consider to be a responsible fashion. But there's a very sizable percentage of legislators where you look at how they're spending this money and you can't help but conclude this is a slush fund. This is stuff that I use so I can drive around in a car that costs $1,300 a month to lease, that I can fly all over the country, indeed all over the world. I don't have to pay taxes on any of this stuff. I mean, I almost thought at one point, one way to address this would be to pass a law to prohibit them from spending any money at an entity that has the word steakhouse in the name. I mean, it was crazy. Some of this stuff, there was more than I could write about. I mean, a legislator who every year throws apparently a fundraiser, but he doesn't use those words, on his birthday at a steakhouse and lobster shop up near Chicago. A legislator who gassed up something like in excess of 70 times at the same gas station that's 50 miles outside of his district, with the money being in round figures. I mean, he would have had to have paid tolls to have gotten to that station. And it got to the point where it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did surprise me. And I guess the thing that really surprised me is this is considered to be the status quo. This is considered to be okay. This is the stuff that we think is okay for the public to know. And one legislator got irate when I asked her about it. She said, this is a legislator that had 2 stays at the Ritz-Carlton and the Cayman Islands in the last 2 years. She had also spent in excess of $500, the campaign records show, at a holistic health clinic in Palm Desert, California. And you can't use this campaign money for personal stuff. And she's spending $500, at least the records show, in excess of $500 for a place that does colon cleansings. And so she said, why is the public interested in this? I don't understand what the interest is, because the money's not coming from the public. And she's right. The money's coming from interest groups, from PACs, from big companies. The public doesn't fund these campaigns. And so, but I think you do have to, and I interviewed Professor Redfield here, he aptly notes, where does the loyalty lie? Does it lie to the constituency? Because keep in mind, the vast majority of those legislative seats are safe. Nobody ever runs against. These guys are running unopposed the vast majority of the time. So are they more interested in representing the interests of their constituents, or are they more interested in living the high life on somebody else's dime?
Well, and as Bruce just mentioned, you were a source for this story, Professor Redfield. How does this work? What are the rules that folks can kind of not document this well and be doing these things?
There used to be no rules. Until 1998, when we banned personal use, people took their campaign fund and they sent their kids to college. They bought houses. I had a legislator who paid his wife's nursing home bills. And so we banned personal use. Now, other states deal with this differently. They say you can only spend money on campaign-related expenses. Here's the list: direct mailing, TV. If it's not on the list, you can't do it. But we've always, historically, we've treated these as, as long as it's not illegal, and now since 1998, as long as you don't create an income tax liability, there really aren't any rules in terms of what you can spend it on. And the problem is, that you're either using it in ways that supplement your lifestyle, becomes a perk, or it looks like it, neither of which is going to build public trust in the system, and it is it's a huge problem in terms of getting a sense of entitlement. And so legislators think that, I'm a member of the General Assembly and I get things and I deserve things, and that's just not, it's not healthy in terms of the climate. We need better rules. Statutorily, we need to give authority to the State Board of Elections to write strict rules and regulations. We need audits. But right now, audits are difficult because when you do a compliance audit, it's against a set of rules and regulations. If there are no rules, then you can hardly say you're not spending the money properly. And so, it has been a scandal for a long time. It is not every member by a General Assembly they're just, most people, I think do try to comply, but, they write the rules, and the agency that enforces the rules has a 4-member board of 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans. They get an appropriation from the General Assembly. They're really not an enforcement regulation agency. They're more of a compliance agency in terms of how they view their role. And so if you don't get it out there, and now hopefully, we've got it out there one more time. We'd like, I certainly would like to see some changes in the way that the law is written and administered.
Yeah, I think you make good points. I think as much as anything, this is reflective, I think, of a political culture. And until you change the culture, it's going to be difficult to change what goes on. And so what maybe needs to happen is, for one thing, these are essentially expense accounts. That's what they would be called in the real world. If you or I turned in something like this to our boss, what would happen is, after our boss stopped laughing, he'd fire us. I mean, there's no question about it. And so I'm not quite sure how to change the culture. I think it probably has to come from the top. But you've got, the House Speaker spends just a lot of money on sports tickets, for example. And so I found, when I reviewed the legislators' campaign accounts, guess what? A lot of legislators spend money on sports tickets. So they're getting, I think, kind of like, Madigan does it, so it's okay for me to do it. Madigan took 4 trips to Turkey, on somebody else's dime. I can do it too. And so there really needs to be a demand that this change, and I don't see a huge demand from the large newspapers in the state or for political leadership to say, knock this stuff off. We look bad enough as it is.
And we're going to have to leave it at that for this week. I'd like to thank my guests, Kent Redfield and Bruce Rushton. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.